Welcome back to Hubbub. Hubbub is an aggregation of seemingly unrelated topics that are so connected. Today we have with us a guest again at House of Groff. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me
Mm-hmm.
again.
Always nice to have guests. Appreciate you being here. Today's topic will be talking about the subject of PTSD, particularly because this month is PTSD Awareness Month and the Awareness Day will be happening on the 27th of this month. So we have it kind of a little bit ahead of time, but will give us a chance to kind of give an overview of what it is and how it affects others. So I have with me open a website from the National Institute of Mental Health, their section for PTSD. And what we're going to do for the beginning part is just give kind of a general overview if you had gone to the website yourself to read it, just as a overview of what we're talking, and then go into more first-hand accounts of how the symptoms of PTSD are experienced in a person's life. Now, given that, we're going to give a trigger warning of anyone who does experience this, that some of these topics may be very personal and could, we don't want to trigger any events in anyone. So if you're uncomfortable with it, now would be the time to skip around or turn off the video. We're going to be getting into a little bit more first-hand events of the symptoms experienced in this. Mm-hmm. So with that being said, we'll transition to the overview. So the description they give is that post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that develops in some people who have experienced a shocking, scary, or dangerous event. Now, some people have thoughts of PTSD being restricted to members of the armed forces, but there is also distinction of there's a class of people that do not have those type of events that occur in that situation, but also have PTSD, which this goes on to explain later, that there are other types of traumatic events that people experience that can cause this to happen or to manifest in someone. It goes on to describe the fight or flight response, which people experience when faced with a threatening situation. Within that amount of time, in a split second, your body switches from its normal state to a state of heightened awareness focused on preserving the body in any way possible. So your senses are heightened and your nervous system is set in place into, as it's described, fight or flight. Fight meaning that your body is prepared to defend itself, or flight is it's ready to flee the situation for safety. Now, typically, people that experience this can continue on without any lasting effects. There are a certain amount of people that after this happens, they will continue to experience problems, and this is what gets diagnosed as PTSD, that they may have those feelings of being stressed or frightened even when they're not in any present danger. Going on, we're going to more of the signs and symptoms. As it says here, not everyone with PTSD has been through a dangerous event. Some experiences could be a sudden unexpected death of a loved one. Others could be more of a sexual nature, violence, different types of situations that would cause you to go into that state and cause lasting effects. We see that the symptoms usually begin early, within 3 months of the incident. Sometimes they can happen years afterwards. So in the case of the trauma being repressed in an individual that may not be ready to process this at the right time, it can be a delayed onset of symptoms. For a person to be considered with PTSD, the symptoms must last for more than a month and also interfere with relationships and or work. So what that means is that it's causing a negative impact on an individual's life and allowing them to lead a quote-unquote normal type of life. These are very distressing symptoms that someone deals with that causes them to experience life in a way that is not typical and is almost can be harmful in some ways to their general health. But we'll go into more of that, why that's the case. In terms of PTSD, some people can recover within at least 6 months. Some other times can last longer. This would be called chronic PTSD. There's also complex PTSD, which covers a different range of symptoms that is experienced by individuals that have an ongoing type of relationship with these symptoms that there is no like immediate type of resolution. Part of the diagnosis would be from a doctor or mental health professional, psychiatrist, psychologist, anyone who has experience with dealing with mental illness can help to diagnose and treat this. Now, we'll be going into 4 different symptoms that are experienced with PTSD, and this is where our guest at House of Groff will be coming in, and myself, and we'll be kind of expounding on how these symptoms affect us in our lives. People may not know, but at House of Groff and myself both live and experience the symptoms of PTSD in our own ways due to our own unique set of situations we've experienced in life. But we're here to explain, kind of shed a little bit more light on how it affects us personally, and then maybe even how each of us deals with it differently. So, let's see. Yep. Yes, thank you also for being here to share that with you. I know this, for many, these topics can be very heavy and very triggering, but I do appreciate you being here and being able to share your own experience and be able to at least help others maybe get a more rounded picture besides just a description.
Oh yeah, of course. Anything to help other people and to make it so that others don't feel that they're experiencing their own unique set of symptoms alone.
So with that, we'll transition more into kind of a conversational segment, and we'll be starting with the first types of symptoms classified here under the title of re-experiencing symptoms. The bullet points will be covering flashbacks, bad dreams, frightening thoughts. So I'll ask you first, any of these that you would like to feel comfortable with sharing, we would be happy to hear and learn from.
Okay. The first thing that I can think of when it comes to flashbacks and bad dreams and frightening thoughts, my trauma is, I guess you could say it's twofold. I have the first chunk of trauma that came from years of abuse as a child and as a young adult, and then a newer trauma that happened. The anniversary is actually coming up this August from an assault that I experienced. So I'm going to talk about the more recent one, although the former traumas, they still apply. I would say probably the first 8 months or so um, were very difficult, and they still can be, even now. But especially the first several months, I experienced a lot of flashbacks. Um, what had happened was that I experienced the assault, coming home from work late one night, um, and so that made it difficult for me to go out in the evening when it was dark, when I was alone after work, um, where I would be walking from the bus, and I would feel like I was reliving the moments before the assault, during the assault, and afterwards, where I would freeze up and I would feel like I could see my attacker. Um, you know, that would definitely happen, where I would feel like a full body reaction to being out alone. I just as the website mentions, is racing heart or sweating exactly. Um, I would feel my heart beating faster. I would start sweating. I would feel dizzy. I would feel frozen, frozen in fear, or I could barely walk because, you know, it was all consuming. And for the first several months, I also had chronic nightmares of the situation, um, everything just replaying bit for bit, detail by detail in my mind.
Yeah, that sounds very difficult to live with, and is something very tough to have, to be able to not only experience it but also to have to live with the reoccurrence of it, coming back into memory, kind of replaying, and also experiencing some of those physical symptoms can be very, uncomfortable is not even a good word to describe it, but just awful to deal with. Yeah, I can relate on some of those things. Part of experiences that I've had, I can talk about, like with the dreams and stuff. Lately, it's been pretty much like a nightmare a week, either from like repressed memories or from kind of like a recurring types of dreams. So usually, like, you start out and you wake up, your heart's racing, you're sweating, you're kind of in a general sense like freaked out by the situation because it feels like it's real. So yeah, these re-experiencing symptoms, they're not at all pleasant to deal with, because physically you feel ill. At least that's how I've experienced it, is that that like adrenaline response that causes you to like the rapid thinking and the ruminating and the cyclical types of thoughts and the reliving things, and yeah, it's not a great experience at all. And it's unfortunate that people who have experienced traumatic events in their lives have to deal with things like this, because it's like experiencing the trauma over and over again.
It really is. It's I can't even put it into words. It's really difficult. It's a burden. It's an invisible burden that people do not see, are not always aware of, that you're carrying around, that you're trying to live everyday life, and yet you're re-experiencing those same frightening thoughts, those same feeling that you're always on edge, hypervigilance, always feeling like you're not safe, or that something ugly is just around the corner, like an impending sense of doom, as they say. It's something that nobody deserves to deal with, but a lot of us do.
And so in times like this, are there things that help, at least Because the re-experiencing symptoms are going to happen. That's
Mm-hmm.
just part of the reality of things. But are there different techniques you've used maybe while you're experiencing them to help ground yourself again or to help um, get out of the fight or flight response?
Definitely. In dealing with former trauma situations, from growing up, as an adult, trying to learn new coping techniques in talk therapy, which by the way is one way that I've been able to cope with dealing with all the years of different types of trauma. Talk therapy for sure. Seeing a psychologist. I also, at that point in time, was taking some medication which helped cut the edge off of the intensity of the situations and the feelings that I was experiencing. It's not for everyone, um, and just saying, you know. But in some cases it's necessary, and in my case it's necessary. Um, so I did that, talk therapy, some medication, which was an antidepressant, and also um, a technique I learned through some EMDR sessions to use some good visualization um, exercises, which helped me feel at least uh, that my emotional energy was protected
Mm-hmm.
or is protected. I use that pretty much every day, um, even on good days, because you always need a little extra something,
Mm-hmm.
to help you keep going. Those are some things that I've definitely used. That, and I have an amazing support system um, of individuals. It's a small support system, but it is a solid one. And not everyone has one, but I am really grateful to have a really good support system that helps me make it through these situations where I can, if I'm feeling really freaked out,
Mm-hmm.
I can text one of the persons in my support system, and I can have a measure of support that will help me get through the frightening moments.
Yeah. Yeah. All of them very important. Very
Mm-hmm.
important to have. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh yeah. What about you?
I have similar things. Definitely therapy has helped out a lot. The talk therapy, um, certain medications, um, certain medications help out with different things I experience. I noticed that not too many help, and maybe it's just not the right ones I'm taking for it, but definitely having the support system, and in the moments that it does get bad, tactile sensation usually helps. So usually anything to keep present and grounded in the moment, because um, typically what will happen is I get lost in the memory and I forget where I'm at because I'm reliving it. So having something physical to twiddle with my thumbs or fingers kind of keeps me remembering that I'm here, not back there. At least that's what's kind of worked for me so far. Tactile sensations.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, hopefully, if that works for some people, if they're tactile, having something like I always used to have a bracelet a lot, that twist around and stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Well, that kind of reminds me of something I learned in a pain class. Um, uh, just a throwback to a former episode with the INTP guy, and a House of Graft guest starring was our fibromyalgia episode, which is also something that I have, that is strongly linked to my PTSD symptoms. Is being able to recognize not only what will be triggering for you, which I know we're gonna get into that later, but um, recognizing the negative, but also uncovering all of the things that will make you feel good and help stave off any possible stressors or triggers.
So having like a ready to go plan, right?
Yeah, like a cozy blanket or a warm bath or calming music or a particular song or maybe there's a poem that makes you feel really good or finding something as simple as asking your loved one for a hug. All those types of things, or telling them to just tell you everything is going to be okay, especially when they can see people who love you and know you very well can pick up on these things and be a help. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
So the next type of symptoms that we see here are under the category of avoidance. And so that takes the form of staying away from places, events, or objects that remind us of traumatic experiences, or even avoiding thoughts or feelings related to the traumatic event. So I can definitely attest to this. There's certain places of childhood or adolescence, I guess, early adulthood, just different places, I'll just say, in general, that I tend to stay away from. Also, just preventing the thoughts from going in a specific direction, because when they start, it kind of goes like a snowball effect and kind of just careens out of control. So part of that is maintenance. Part of the maintenance I've learned in therapy is to kind of stay out of the forest kind of thing. Like if you're stuck in the trees, kind of take a helicopter, kind of view it from outside, kind of get an outside perspective of the thoughts you're experiencing, because it is easy to kind of get lost in it. So yeah, avoidance symptoms. These are kind of just staying away from those reminders.
Yeah.
Can you bring any examples of how maybe you've experienced this?
Oh yeah, absolutely. After the more recent assault trauma, there were a couple of things that I did. At that point in time, I had just started a new job, and I had only been working at my job 2 weeks, and I had to miss 2 weeks to recover, because it brought on all kinds of triggers and flares, and I realized a few things right away. First was that I was going to need to ask for some kind of accommodation at work, because I was finding myself being startled really easily. I couldn't be in closed, confined spaces. Anything that worked pretty much before the event happened was no longer. It was just it was such a huge game changer. I definitely had to yeah, it was really stressful. I'm just thinking about it right now. Yeah, I had to make sure I asked for accommodations. I also had to change the way that I functioned, and I didn't really need to change it. Life just changed by itself. I went from loving late night walks to not walking outside after the sun went down at all, unless I was with people, and even then it was very, very difficult. Riding on the bus alone was difficult, but especially at work, where there were a lot of I worked at a bookstore where there were a lot of nooks, hidden. There were a lot of tall bookcases and shelves where there were blind spots, and there were also a lot of very boisterous customers, even in a bookstore, who would come up from behind me and say hello and startle me. And so I started. I had to make it a point to avoid being in those physical places. I had to ask to shelve books in a main area where it was very open. There were a lot of my coworkers around, and I had to ask coworkers to wait with me while I waited for the bus or for a ride, at the end of a shift. In fact, it got to a point where I stopped closing altogether, where I avoided evening time just completely, as far as work goes. Where I would only work, I would work opening, which was, it was dark in the morning, but it was just a little different, than being in the evening. I would work from the opening to like 3 in the afternoon, 4 in the afternoon, and I don't know if that really answers it, but yeah, I'd really just heavily, it wasn't even a choice really. I had to completely heavily avoid anything that even looked remotely like the situation I experienced.
Yeah. Well, I could definitely see how that specific event had such a domino effect in your life. I mean, changing how your schedule is, changing where you're working, how you work, when you work, like this complete readjustment in order to cope with stuff like that. And that's kind of, I'm glad you shared that, because that is kind of the degree of how this can affect someone's personal life and their work life, is that a single event can cause you to completely have to restructure everything you do or how you do in order just to cope with it. And that's so it's a great examples of how it affects, not only like what it affects, but how it affects, and kind of the work involved afterward by the individual. So well, we're always sorry for the things that anyone goes through, but we appreciate you being very candid.
Oh yeah. No problem.
Yeah. And you kind of touched on some of these other symptoms kind of under the arousal and reactivity, so I want to just kind of bring those in. But that kind of talks about kind of that, what you were talking about, which was being that easily startled, feeling on edge. Some of the other bullet points talks about difficulty sleeping or having angry outbursts. But what I found interesting about this section to explain, or at least to bring to light, was that these symptoms, they're usually constant instead of being triggered by things that remind us. So as opposed to the avoidance section, which triggers that memory of the event, the arousal symptoms are a constant symptom that is being experienced by the individual. So even if they aren't being reminded of the place, as you even brought out, that you change your schedule, you change the time you go to, how you work, these are still things that you experience, despite avoiding the reminders. So that kind of, those things, yeah. There's like
Oh yeah.
yeah, you touched on it very well.
Thank you. And I'm just thinking about it right now, looking at kind of this section of the site. I remember the first several days after the assault, I had no appetite. That was probably one of the only times that I've ever experienced that, where I had zero appetite. I was having also fibromyalgia flare symptoms, where I couldn't, make a fist, and my whole body was in pain, and I was achy, also from being physically attacked. But I felt this great emptiness for the first chunk of that time, and then it took a long time for that feeling to go away. I guess that's, and it was replaced by the being easily startled and not wanting to be surprised ever, not liking anyone to, like, even now, walk, all these symptoms, they slowly recede, or they change themselves. They become less intense depending on the day. But even when I'm with a group of people, wanting to be at the back of the group, not wanting anyone behind me. Sometimes even now when I'm walking to work, I have a new job now. I will get startled if it's a little a little early and I hear somebody jogging behind me or walking behind me, I'll turn around and I have to
Yeah.
figure out a way to not freak out in the middle of the street, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very real thing. Yeah, I mean, part of, I can relate on certain levels where, um, like, sudden noises, or, you know, yeah, just like sudden movements, sudden noises kind of throw me off a little bit, make me more tense, or getting that easily startled kind of, how to describe, it's like a sudden, like, shot of adrenaline you feel in your
Yes.
body, like you feel like immediately you're like, ugh, and you're kind of frozen for a minute, and it's like I've always tried to deal with that, but it's like it's just a thing that's gonna be there,
Oh yeah.
unfortunately. But yeah, like you said before, kind of helping to manage it is that you have a plan beforehand. I mean, even if it can't be entirely avoided, um, it can be dealt with in a constructive way so that it's not as um, intense of an emotion that gets drawn upon, I guess. If that's, I'm trying to articulate it in a way that makes sense, is that you can't really entirely avoid it, but at least in the experience I've had, is that maybe being aware of what um, creates that response
Can
of being,
anticipate it a little bit.
yeah, like understanding, yes, what I'm feeling right now, I am safe, and this is a startle response because of things I've been through in the past. But this case is not something, I'm not in danger, and that's kind of having a rational mind, or like wise mind kind of thing, where you can take your feelings, acknowledge your feelings, but also acknowledge the rational argument, which is that yes, I feel freaked out. However, this situation is not dangerous for me, so that therefore I can deal with it in a healthy way and kind of experience through the feelings. It's difficult though.
I getcha. It is really difficult to do that, but I totally know what you're saying.
In an
Yeah,
ideal world, that's how it would work.
you want to be able
But
to
in
rationalize
reality,
it. Well, when you're right in the situation, it is so hard to talk yourself out of feeling completely flipped out. You know, like my psychologist. I remember she she could see how just thrown I was by everything. It was so jarring to my system, everything that happened. And one thing that she mentioned was that, she says, you have to tell yourself, um, well, you have to remember that one of the earlier traumas that you had was when you were 6 years old. And so that's how your brain sort of processes things, like as if you are a helpless child. Um, Not in any kind of like derogatory, negative way. It's just, that's one of your early severe traumas. So this is what your body learned. So sometimes you revert to feeling helpless, like you have no control, when in actuality, when you're out of the situation at least and you're healing, you are able to say to yourself, hey, wait a second, I am 20 something years old, I am 30 something years old, I'm 50 something years old. I don't have to rely on those old coping mechanisms that I had when I was 6 and didn't know how to process what was going on. Now I am this age and I'm an adult, and now I can call the police, or look up, pull out a meditation app or something, to help me get through this, and or call a friend. Um, I don't know, that's just kind of what it made me think of. That we are able to, but that's usually after the fact.
yeah,
When you're right in the situation, or rather, I should say, right when you're in the triggered situation, when you're reliving things, you're having flashbacks or nightmares, or you're having to. One thing we haven't mentioned is having to like avoid crowds because you feel overstimulated. That's another symptom of. That's probably next, but yeah, those are the type of things that you're able to control. You realize you have more control than you think, but when you're triggered, it doesn't really feel that way.
yeah, and yeah, really, like, the best thing you can do, like you were mentioning, is that kind of having a ready to go plan and having a good support system and kind of just gaining as much understanding in the times that you're not experiencing this, which is when you're not in the thick of it, because then you can kind of have that, you can think about it in a way that's not, we're not compromised in a way. It's just
reflecting in a safe space. Yeah.
So our next category is under cognition and mood symptoms. And so I'm going to just read the bullet points here. First bullet point: trouble remembering key features of the traumatic event, negative thoughts about oneself or the world, distorted feelings like guilt or blame, and loss of interest in enjoyable activities. So, you can tackle one or any of these if you'd like. But I guess I can talk a little bit, I guess, on like losing interest in enjoyable things. Is that when, at least in my experience, is that when going through different events and then dealing with the after effects, it definitely changes your perception of the world, and in some cases it made me more cautious around people and around events, around just general everyday things, to a point where feeling like I needed to protect myself from any type of possibility of something happening again, would kind of forget about doing anything extra with anyone, or knowing, doing an activity that I know I would benefit from. I would just avoid it completely because I just didn't want to take a chance. I didn't want to have to relive anything again, or the possibility. It's just the possibilities of having to relive something again prevented me from ever wanting to enjoy things that I knew would help. And that's kind of, at least that's something I could probably attest to in this, in these bullet points.
I think the first two really apply to what I experienced. The first one, trouble remembering key features of the traumatic event. That's a really huge one for me. Not with the more recent trauma, but with my childhood traumas. And we could have a whole episode on that, on childhood trauma, and child abuse. But there are chunks of my childhood that I just do not remember. Probably, and according to my, any mental health professional I've ever come across, they tell me, it was probably so traumatizing and painful that your mind is kind of leaving it to the side for a little bit until you're ready to deal with it. There's a lot that I don't remember from the age 6 or 7 until I turned 12 or 12. So, yeah, from about 6 to 12. That's 6 years of not remembering any summers or school or anything,
Yeah.
Which is incredible to me. But I know that there were really terrible things going on in my life at that point in time. I just can't remember the exact details of everything.
Yeah.
And as for the second point, negative thoughts about myself or the world, that's definitely true. That's something that I struggle with since my more recent trauma of the assault. And I guess, now that I'm saying that out loud, it makes a lot of sense. I'm naturally a more idealistic person and optimistic when it comes to other people and the world. But after the assault, it's been very difficult for me to, I guess, reconcile all this, just to be able to realize that not every person I come across has good intentions. I mean, this is not something, I'm not trying to be naive, but in thinking that every person is inherently good or bad or anything like that. But I mean, I have this feeling at times since the assault that not everyone sometimes that the world is out to get me in a strange way, that people are irritated with me or don't like me, or and that also is tied to the earlier traumas too. But feeling that as I walk down the street, people are either looking at me, judging me, or that uh, uh, people are something to bear through. I don't know if that makes any sense. Like interactions with people are just, it's, I don't know, it's very very difficult. That's not naturally how I think as an individual, not how I always did. But since the assault, I've noticed that it's been really difficult for me with interactions with other people, and especially working in customer service. It's hard because you forget that the people you're serving are actual people and not enemies.
Yeah.
And not to use such an extreme word, but I think you know what I'm getting at. You know, it's tough.
Well, yeah, I can definitely relate with that because the events that happen, like, yeah, change or alter your perceptions, how you take in information, how you associate information, and it could be not even anything like threatening. It could be just a completely benign example of just some random person, but there could be something that they're wearing or something that they say or one way they move, and that's just enough to bring something back, and it's enough to cause a trigger to happen. And it's like it's like you're always walking on the edge of that fight or flight response when dealing with everything. So it's not great at all, because then you kind of lose that aspect of the human connection because of having to feel on guard, because you had to be on guard during the time that happened. So it's just kind of like a hard cycle to go through. But like we said, though, the talk therapy is very important. Certain medications, depending on how it works for you. The support groups. There's many organizations out there too. For instance, this website we're using is the National Institute of Mental Health. There's another nationwide one, NAMI, which is very well known. That's another one for mental illness. But we just kind of like trying to spread awareness of how you can find help if you're experiencing any of these symptoms, because if it is to the point where it is causing a negative impact on your life, in your relationships, in your work, there's help out there, and there are people and there's resources that are readily available that can provide a support. And if there's support groups aren't near you, there's many support groups online too that can help at least deal with symptoms, and also find like-minded people, and also learn from other people's experiences and how they deal with it.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of in social media, there's Facebook groups, there are Instagram accounts that are there's where the Instagram its sole purpose is to be a support to individuals who are experiencing PTSD and complex PTSD, every type of trauma and mental illness, everything, chronic illness. I really love that. It's a very good resource, because you're connecting to, like, especially if you aren't able to meet up with a physical group, you are still connecting via social media with other individuals who are experiencing similar symptoms, sometimes the same, sometimes completely different, but it's still a connection. It's still it's still a group of humans that care, that will end up caring about you and that you'll care about.
So very, very important. And yes, there's help out there, and there's support out there, and many people ready, readily available to offer their insight and support. Um, so we'd like to conclude with those thoughts and just being able to take some time and be able to discuss PTSD, kind of give the overview. I'll post the website that the information was taken from for this episode in the description. And as always, I just appreciate the time and hope that this information can help anyone else out there that's dealing with this. So with that, we'll be signing off, and thank you again for joining us.
And I just want to say to anyone who's actually taking the time to listen, thank you so much, and we hope this is helpful to you, and we want you to feel supported even in the massive online web, and that nothing is ever hopeless. There's always some help.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So this is INTP Guy and at House of Groff signing off.